All right, let's move on. The English Premier League is kind of facing a sort of reckoning, if you will, with some unsavory characters. For decades, they've had this relationship with some of the world's most powerful suspect actors who have brought out the cash for teams and for all kinds of things. Now, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they're calling on the EPL to implement standards that will ban people associated with human rights abuses. Where are we on this, Steve?
Well, it's really actually, I want to give the American background. I love for Neil to give the British perspective, because if you look at the history in the United States, there have been unsavory characters who have owned teams. And when they cross a line, they are forced to sell those teams. Marge Schott was the owner of the Cincinnati Reds. An employee came out and said that she kept a Nazi swastika armband at her home. Now, Marge Schott, she issued a statement saying, well, those claims of racism are overstated. That swastika armband was just a gift from a former employee. Well, shortly thereafter, she had to sell, the Cincinnati Reds. Jerry Richardson, when Sports Illustrated came, he was the owner of the Carolina Panthers. He was a very famous football player in his playing days. He was a very successful owner. When it came out that there was 4 employees who said that there were monetary settlements due to his being a sexist, being a misogynist, and being a racist, he coincidentally sold the team that day. He announced the sale that day. And so there have been very strict standards in the United States about ownership, and that doesn't seem to be the case in the EPL. It seems to be, if you give us a lot of money, we are going to let you sports wash. I don't know, Neil, is that accurate?
Right. That is extremely accurate. And I almost laugh incredulously as someone who's covered this for 20 years. I mean, when the Human Rights Watch has called on the EPL to implement standards, I can almost hear the EPL power brokers laughing as if to say, who's the Human Rights Watch? Look, you have a World Cup in 2022 that should never be happening in Qatar. It is. Yep. You can make a case saying it shouldn't have even been held in Russia, but it's being held in Qatar. Thousands of workers have died building these white elephants that are going to be completely meaningless and pointless once the World Cup ends. The stadiums, the stadia around Qatar. Yeah. The way the EPL is right now is it's dug itself such an economic hole, Steve, that the only people, entities, states that can buy an EPL club at this point need at least $4 or $5 billion US to play around with. Chelsea is up for sale because of Roman Abramovich. There seems to be a consortium led by Americans, but the American difference is they leverage. They're saddling themselves with debt from banks, American banks. They do not have $4 or $5 billion just sitting there. They're using bank money in the way that the Glazers did, and sucks millions out of Manchester United every single year. Yeah. So what are your alternatives? You either go to Middle Eastern oil money or you go to China. But China has already said that they're pulling back slightly. They went massive on international sports investment 5 or so years ago, but they've since pulled back on that, as Steve knows, and is looking inward. So the issue is, Steve, for EPL has just got too big for its own boots. Where do you find the money?
And this is where I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine and people saying, we're now going to look very differently at all aspects of business. We don't care if we're going to lose money because we don't want to support this type of activity. And so the human rights abuses, which have occurred in businesses when it comes to supply chains or when it comes to ownership, you are now getting called out on that. And it used to be with business, right? We're going to source from the cheapest possible place, and we're not going to look behind the curtain. We're not going to look to see if it's 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls who are doing the sewing. And we're not going to look behind, into the mine to see if it's, literally, 10 and 11-year-olds going down to get the cobalt out because it's easier than sending an adult because you need a bigger hole. Well, you know what? You're going to look behind the curtain now, and that's going to happen in the EPL. And if it's going to mean some player salaries are going to come down, or if it's going to mean ticket prices are going to go up, you're going to have to balance it out somehow.
But shouldn't it be driven by the government, Steve? I actually feel sorry for fans in this instance. Everyone's piling on Chelsea fans and Newcastle fans, because Newcastle has just been bought by the Saudi Arabians with an astonishing human rights record. But it's not the fans' fault. They literally cannot choose who buys their club. Surely the impetus must come from government level, Steve.
Well, I mean, I think it's coming from the consumers. The consumers are leading it, and then the governments, can often follow when the consumers set the right path. I mean, if somebody, the question is, if somebody violates the law, you could clearly say that they shouldn't be allowed to have certain ownerships. But what happens if somebody violates, if Russia, invades Ukraine, and that could be illegal under some law, but how do you enforce that? I mean, that's something that I think the club and the EPL is a business, which of course the EPL has to make the business decision. Do we want our money coming from people who have made their money through human rights abuses or have committed crimes while running governments?
You cannot violate the law unless you're Will Smith.